So Simon, 1988, were you teaching in school?
Just coming in, I trained in just a couple of years after that, so I came in with the first national curriculum. Well, actually, the first national curriculum was already being revised. That was when I was first.
When you came in.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got 1988. We're all saying this year. We think this year is like a kind of year zero.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's see if we can conjure up something of the moment. So Sir Kenneth Baker is in charge of education. He's the Secretary of State for Education. We've got a Conservative government in. There has been some turmoil, probably off the back of James Callaghan's speech at Ruskin College. Which when you look at it now doesn't seem to sort of be quite as much of a watershed as everybody said it was. So we'll leave that out for the moment. Yeah. And Kenneth Baker then presents a kind of new situation, and he's saying that something new is going to happen. Yeah. And it caused a huge uproar across the whole of the profession, not just English teachers. Yeah. So it just specifically on English teaching, how do you read that 88 moment?
It's interesting looking back to it and talking to people, because I get a sense from people that their feelings then are very different than they are now, and a lot of what's happened since has made people re-evaluate actually that time. It's interesting obviously because prior to that it didn't seem to be that curriculum was particularly of much interest to the Conservative government at the time. They're more interested in sorting out school management systems and that kind of competition element of education, but they got round to assessment and curriculum eventually at the back end of the 80s. They had these HMI booklets, English Matters, Curriculum Matters 5 to 16, so they had kind of embryonic versions of the English curriculum.
And you had the great report, you had the Bullock report, and for primary schools the Plowden report, in which there was, Bullock was obviously Language for Life, that was specifically on English, Plowden across the whole primary curriculum, so English had in a sense been institutionalised beyond the level of the classroom. It wasn't as if teachers were just let go hang.
Absolutely.
And obviously you had HMI that was coming around implementing. So when Baker arrived, what was he implementing that was different from, if you like, Bullock and Plowden and HMI? What's actually materially different?
Well, now we have the statutory orders, so we have, this is legally what you have to teach. Although obviously the interesting thing is that the curriculums that evolved from Cox and the Kingman report, that wasn't curriculum orientated necessarily, were not curriculums that the Tory government at the time wanted. That became very clear very quickly.
So we just be very clear here. So we had a Cox report, and Cox came out of what was really quite an informal set of papers, the so-called black papers, where they had shock horror stories of education that had gone on in the 70s and 80s. It partly came from Cox's own personal experience with his children, who he claimed were betrayed by the system, and everyone was going to the dogs. My own children entered the education system, my oldest, 1978, he's born in 76, get this right, so 79, so I could in fact compare what they were saying about the education system with the education they were actually having. So we've got these new reports coming out that Baker is using to inform him as to what to do, and then to what extent is Baker and the government laying down what shall be taught in English lessons?
Well, they're laying out a fair amount of content in the first curriculum. They're not saying anything about pedagogy. There's nothing in there about how to teach. There is nothing in there actually really specifying content in terms of authors.
There was an attempt to, because they produced a list, and I'm afraid to say children's writers boycotted it. I'm afraid there was a very nasty letter that came from people saying we don't want this list and we don't want to be on it, and that possibly put the kibosh on that. Far be it from me to claim credit.
No, I'm sure it did. And what's interesting about, I think, politically about the introduction of that first curriculum, his first statutory national curriculum, but there was a sort of hesitancy, I think, and they did respond to consultation, and I think Cox clearly listened to people.
Yes.
And particularly his view of standard English and the teaching of grammar was very much modified by conversations with professionals. So
with Nate and Late.
Exactly. Yes. So you saw the professional associations having say in that and having a sense of ameliorating what could have been the worst excesses of a curriculum had it been created in the eyes of the policymakers at that time.
A moment on their side not helped greatly by the fact that on the list of authors they included the name E. Brill. And nobody knew who E. Brill was, other than it's possibly an obscure Dutch publisher. That they'd mistaken the name E. Brill for a very, very important author, and in actual fact was a a publisher of kind of Erasmus, so faux pas like that didn't, if you're trying to say you are the tradition and you're representing, because Baker spoke a lot about how the whole heritage of English literature bit, which matters massively to him personally, and he wanted to somehow pass that on, and that somehow or other you evil people in the classroom are not passing it on. If you're going to say you must all read E. Brill, that kind of is slightly a kind of a very firm bullet in the foot there, wasn't it? Yeah, absolutely. So they did have a problem with that. Now, I just want to bring up a bit of politics here. This is my view. I think that Nate and Late, and indeed my dear father and many other people in the profession, were not politically ready, I'll count myself in this, in any way as to what transformation was about to take place or was actually taking place. Because up until this moment, up until 1988, there was an understanding or a belief within the teaching profession, the English teaching profession, that the way the curriculum was carried out was through discussion. So if I produce a paper from within Nate or Late or the Institute of Education or Birmingham Institute or wherever, people would read this and go, I could try this out in the classroom. Now that was, and they thought, these folks behind all this stuff, that the better their documents were, the more it would affect the situation. And what they weren't ready for was the fact that people came into government and said, no, we will just wipe that to one side because we are the politicians. Therefore, we can take an act and decide on it, and it will happen. And no matter what you guys say, you can. I'm talking to you specifically here, Simon. If you like, you can say what you like, pal. We're here at the DFE. We will do it. And that transformation took place between '88 and now, if you like, more and more and more. So that you can come banging on the door. You could have a whole queue of guys out there, a whole deputation. We don't care. We've worked this out with our mates, what'll happen. And none of us were ready for this piece of politics. Was that fair or not fair?
I think that's fair, but I think in the early days, the lack of acceptance of that, if you like, was strengthened by the fact that people had that professional sense of themselves and having negotiated curriculums prior to that time. So you still had the sense that English teachers, I'll speak specifically for us now, were willing to protest when it wasn't what they wanted it to be, and particularly around assessment. So you had the SATS boycott, which was, it was begun really from a mood of disbelief at the anthology that was passed out that would have to be studied by all 14-year-olds, which had some bizarre pieces of canonical literature. And at that point, English teachers felt, yes, very much, that this is not the way it works. We negotiate curriculum, we respond to the children in front of us, we create an English that works. We may be informed by the government reports or the HMI, but ultimately it's our responsibility, it's our children. That had changed, people weren't ready for it. I don't think they kind of accepted it at first, and they felt strong enough to protest against it. And I think that's, over time, that kind of central imposition has become more slick, it's become more powerful, and people have lost that memory of any sort of collective action or sense that they can do that. So when it came to, I remember being in one consultation room for, I don't know which iteration of the curriculum it was, where there'd been a list put in of authors by this point. We argued very strongly as a collective group, and there were people from UKLA and whatever there, that shouldn't be there, that teachers should be given that choice to choose the authors, because teachers generally know what they want to teach and know something about books. They then agreed that would go, but the next meeting it came back in, and that was expressly at the minister's instruction, and that was going to be a non-negotiable, that list was going to have to be there. So, it's very clearly it became more and more taken into the hands of fewer and fewer people, and then the consultations, it became very obvious, were, they were paper exercises or then nods to consultation to say that so-and-so's been involved in this. But the power of teachers and teacher organisations over time, I think, is absolutely right. It's become less and less and less, and the machinery driving through has become better at doing that and better informed at doing it.
So this is only going to be anecdotal, impressionistic, if you like. So if we can imagine we're a fly on the wall in the 60s or 70s, it doesn't matter when, and an attitude amongst certain teachers, at any rate, that there is this sense that you can research your own practice, or you can discuss it, you can talk about it, that you have abilities to both teach but also to reflect on what you teach and how you teach, and that you have staff meetings in which you discuss this, or you can go to professional associations like NATE and LATE, or indeed read their documents when they come out in their journals and so on. So there is if you like, a teacher who is like this. And then if we then leap forward and do the same fly on the wall act in the 90s, or indeed in the 2000s and whatever they are, the beginning of the 21st century, do you think that there has been a change in attitude to oneself amongst teachers? So now you've mentioned collective action. Let's put that to one side for a moment and say, I'm an English teacher. I come into the profession. I've been in the profession for 4 or 5 years and I'm working. To what extent do I think I am an autonomous human being? Can I sit down with my fellow English teachers in a staff meeting and go, what do you reckon? Shall we do the romantics, or what about the metaphysicals? In some ways, the metaphysicals, you think of John Donne, busy old fool, unruly son, or, Mark Butt this flea, and, it's kind of sexy stuff, I mean, the romantics are great, but, the metaphysicals might grab them just a bit more. Does that conversation take place anymore?
If it does, I'm not a party to it very often. I mean, I think it's tied up with so many other things about the education system now, to do with the accountability framework, the performance management framework, all those things that put individual teachers and then the heads of department and then the senior teacher under so much unbearable pressure that you can see why it is that people have found themselves, I think, in the positions of feeling that the best thing we can do is do what we think we should be doing or what we're told to be doing, and then hopefully that'll work. If it doesn't work, we can fail saying we've done it the way you told us to do it. And there's that kind of sense of that. It is a kind of all-encompassing accountability framework which has worked its way into a level of personal professionalism that means people don't, I think, feel confident to have that discussion anymore necessarily, or feel that they're allowed to have it, or feel that the risk is worth taking anymore, because it's seen as a risk, I think, to do things in an imaginative way or in a personal way, or say, well, look, let's go back to square one. What would we want to do with English for the whole of, Key Stage 3? If we had our ideal curriculum, what would we make it look like? And ironically, the freedom's there to do that to a certain extent now, and yet I don't think people feel that, or feel the confidence, or feel that they will be supported if things don't go right, that you can experiment, you can try something out, you can do something and learn from it and make it better the next time. It's got to be successful, it's got to work, standards have to go up, you've got that assessment at the end of next week, that data has to be reported. This is the kind of world in which most teachers I work with live in, so I don't, I wouldn't individually criticise the person or the department or whatever, but I think that culture has led to people's sense of themselves as not being autonomous professionals anymore. It's being part of a machinery and not being the bit of that machinery that, you don't want to be the bit that fails and brings the whole thing crashing down because, the stakes are too high.